It is the year 52 BC, and the Roman dream of domination over Gaul stands on the edge of collapse. The Gallic tribes, fierce, proud, and fractious, had long fought among themselves, but now, for the first time in living memory, they find unity under one name, Vercingetorix, the young chieftain of the Arverni. To his people, he is the saviour of Gaul, the man who can drive the Romans back across the Alps and restore their freedom. To Caesar, he is a ghost of past rebellions, a clever, calculating enemy who refuses to fight by Rome's rules. That year, as the snows thickened over the Alps, Caesar himself was trapped in Italy. His legions lay scattered in winter quarters across a restless land. Rumours spread like wildfire that the Romans were weak, their hold on Gaul fading, their governor cut off by the mountains. It was the perfect time to strike. In a storm of betrayals and ambushes, Gallic warriors rose from every forest and river valley. Entire Roman detachments were overrun. One of Caesar's finest units, the 14th Legion, was wiped out to the last man after being deceived by supposed allies. The dream of Roman Gaul seemed ready to burn to ash. When the news reached Caesar, it hit like thunder. The general who had conquered half of Europe now faced the possibility of total disaster. But Caesar was not a man who yielded to circumstance. He gathered what troops he could, veterans, engineers and cavalry, and began a march that would become legend. Through sleet and ice, his army clawed its way across the Alpine passes, dragging wagons and siege engines through snowdrifts taller than men. Soldiers wrapped their feet in animal hides to keep them from freezing. For days they marched without rest, guided only by the stars and Caesar's voice cutting through the wind. He would not wait for spring. He would not allow his empire to die in the cold. By the time he crossed into Gaul, the countryside was already burning. Vercingetorix had seized towns, slaughtered Roman garrisons, and called every tribe to arms. Thousands answered his call: Eburones, Bituriges, Senones, and countless others, each swearing to reclaim their land from Rome's iron grip. They saw Caesar not as a man, but as a beast of conquest, a destroyer of their world. And yet, deep within the Roman ranks, the men who followed him believed the opposite. To them, Caesar was destiny itself, calm, invincible, a living symbol of Roman order against barbarian chaos. His victories had made them legends. His ambition had made them immortal. The coming campaign would test that faith. Across the plains and forests of Gaul, villages emptied as warriors gathered beneath Vercingetorix's crimson banners. Scouts whispered of numbers unseen in any Roman war, armies large enough to blot out the horizon. Caesar's officers argued for retreat, for caution, for reason. But Caesar only listened to the beat of his own strategy. He knew the tribes would seek open battle. He also knew that in the open, the legions would crush them. So when Vercingetorix began to pull back, refusing to fight, Caesar understood. His enemy was playing a different game. The Arvernian chief would not fight to destroy Rome's legions in a single clash. He would fight to starve them, to burn every field, poison every well, and deny Caesar the lifeblood of supplies. A war of fire and hunger. Town after town fell to the flames. Roman granaries were seized, supply lines cut. Caesar's soldiers began to mutter. Was this truly the invincible general they followed, or a man leading them into ruin? Yet Caesar pressed on, his eyes fixed on one name, one fortress that would decide it all. Alesia, a hilltop stronghold rising from the heart of central Gaul, its slopes steep, its walls thick, its spirit unbroken. There, Vercingetorix withdrew with tens of thousands of warriors. He believed the Romans would never dare attack such a fortress, that the tribes of Gaul would rise in one vast wave and crush the invaders once and for all. For the first time in the Gallic Wars, Caesar faced not just an army, but an idea, the united will of an entire people. What followed would become one of the most astonishing sieges in the history of warfare. 250,000 Gauls against barely 60,000 Romans, and at its heart one man determined to bend the impossible to his will. The Roman legions had held the field, but victory was far from certain. Across the forests and hills of Gaul, A new force was gathering, one that could challenge Rome like never before. From the smoke of burned villages and the ashes of conquered towns, Vercingetorix, a young chieftain of the Arverni, began to unite the fractious tribes under a single purpose: resistance. He had studied the Romans, understood their strengths and weaknesses, and learned that direct confrontation would only lead to ruin. Instead, he wove a strategy of patience and cunning, scorched earth, hit-and-run raids, and the destruction of resources that Rome relied upon. Every plundered field, every razed granary, forced the invaders to stretch their supply lines and tested their endurance. Word of his leadership spread like wildfire. Tribes long divided by centuries of rivalry now answered his call. Warriors from the Arverni, Senones, Carnutes and Baturiges gathered beneath his banners, drawn by the promise of unity and vengeance. His presence alone instilled courage, a sense that for the first time Gaul might stand as one. Caesar watched these maneuvers with a wary eye. He understood that Vercingetorix was no ordinary foe. Every raid, every clever withdrawal, chipped away at Roman control. The young chieftain was shaping the battlefield even before the two armies would meet, forcing Rome into a game where survival itself would demand every ounce of discipline and ingenuity. By the spring of 52 BC, the Gallic rebellion had become an unstoppable tide. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very limits of strategy, endurance, and leadership. A confrontation that would lead both commanders to the cliffs and ramparts of Alesia, where history itself would be decided. By summer of 52 BC, Vercingetorix had drawn the Gauls together, and the stage was set. The young chieftain's forces gathered atop the hill fort of Alesia, a natural fortress perched high above the surrounding plains. From this vantage he could watch Caesar's legions approach, already spread thin from months of campaigning across hostile territory. Caesar, however, was not a man to be cornered. What began as pursuit had transformed into a campaign of audacious engineering and ruthless precision. He surveyed the heights, measured the terrain, and saw not just a fortified town but an opportunity. If the Gauls were to be trapped, it would require more than brute force. It would demand the genius of Roman discipline, strategy, and invention. Within days, the legions began constructing what would become a masterpiece of military engineering. Trenches carved into the earth, ramparts of timber and earth rising like walls of a citadel, and towers positioned to rain missiles on any daring attacker. Hidden traps, sharpened stakes, and concealed pits transformed the slopes into a deadly gauntlet. Every legionary was a labourer, every cohort a construction crew. Rome was building not just a siege, it was building a fortress within a fortress, a gauntlet designed to withstand any relief force that Vercingetorix might summon. Supplies were stockpiled with meticulous care. Each man carried enough grain and fodder to endure 30 days in the face of encircled enemies. The Romans would not starve first. Every decision, every log lifted, every ditch dug, was designed to turn the odds against them, not by luck, but by preparation. Meanwhile, inside Alesia, the Gauls faced their own challenges. The town was crowded beyond capacity, provisions dwindling and morale fragile. Vercingetorix ordered non-combatants expelled, women, children, the elderly, hoping to ease the strain. Yet the Romans allowed none to leave. Starvation became a weapon, a psychological knife cutting through hope as the encirclement tightened like a vice. From this tension, Caesar's genius would emerge. He positioned his cohorts with careful precision, ensuring that every section of the fortifications could respond to attack. Cavalry reserves were hidden, waiting for the decisive moment. Every detail anticipated the enemy's moves, every plan accounted for disaster. The siege of Alesia was no ordinary battle. It was a test of will, innovation and endurance, a confrontation where both sides knew that history would judge the outcome. Vercingetorix's Gauls could rely on numbers, spirit, and a fortress high above the plains. Caesar's Romans relied on discipline, ingenuity, and a belief in the unbreakable cohesion of their legions. The first scouts appeared beyond the Roman lines. The tension was palpable. Soon, The clash that would decide Gaul's fate would begin, and the world would witness a siege unlike any other in the annals of warfare. The dawn mist clung to the hills of Alesia as Caesar's engineers completed the impossible. In less than 3 weeks, the legions had surrounded the Gallic fortress with a ring of earth and steel, an unbroken line of walls stretching for 11 miles. Behind that, they built another, facing outward. 2 fortifications, 2 worlds, one to keep the Gauls in and one to keep the rescuers out. To the men inside, it felt like being buried alive. To the men outside, it looked like Rome had built a second city, a silent waiting predator of timber and stone. Caesar called it the circumvallation and contravallation, words that would become legend among military minds for centuries. Vercingetorix watched from the heights, his pride giving way to unease. His scouts had vanished into the Roman lines, his foraging parties slaughtered or captured. The ring was tightening, and every road to escape was sealed. Yet he believed, he had to believe, that help would come. Word had gone out across Gaul. Hundreds of tribes, roused by the dream of freedom, were marching to break the Roman chains. Inside Alesia, hunger gnawed at the defenders. The cries of the expelled civilians still echoed in the valley, haunting both sides. But the Romans did not break. Their camps pulsed with the rhythm of discipline, patrols changing watch, blacksmiths hammering weapons, engineers testing new defences. Every legionary knew his place, every cohort trusted the next. The army had become a machine, tireless, efficient, terrifying. Then, from beyond the horizon, the ground began to tremble. Drums, horns, and the thunder of hooves announced what the Gauls had prayed for. The relief army had arrived. 250,000 warriors surged over the ridges, a tidal wave of spears and banners filling the plains as far as the eye could see. The trapped Gauls roared from the walls. Vercingetorix raised his sword high, signalling the beginning of the final test. Between the 2 armies stood Caesar's 50,000, encased within their double walls. 1 man against 2 enemies, 1 army against a nation. He looked upon his creation, this fortress of human will, and prepared to fight a battle on 2 fronts at once, a battle no general had ever won before. As the Gauls charged, the iron circle of Rome braced for impact. Trumpets blared, siege engines thundered, and the plains of Alesia erupted into chaos. The drums of war echo through the hills of Alesia. Beneath their thunder, Caesar's legions labour without rest. Hammers strike through the night, shovels carve the frozen ground, and the light of 1,000 torches flickers against walls of earth and timber. Each sound is a heartbeat in Rome's struggle to survive. All around them, the fortress of Alesia looms, its Gallic defenders watching from above. Inside, Vercingetorix prepares for deliverance. Outside, Caesar builds for endurance. But beyond the horizon, another storm is forming. A second Gallic host, hundreds of thousands strong, marching to crush the Romans from behind. When Caesar sees the rising haze of dust, he knows the truth. The trap he set has become his own. 50,000 Romans now stand between 2 armies, one inside the walls, one approaching from the plains. Most men would fall to panic. Caesar answers with calculation. He orders a second line of defences, another wall, this one facing outward. 2 rings of fortification, 25 miles of trenches, palisades and towers. The Romans carve an empire out of mud and fear, constructing a fortress between 2 wars. From the ramparts of Alesia, the Gauls laugh as they watch. But when the second wall rises, the laughter dies. Vercingetorix realises the scale of Caesar's design. This is no mere siege. It is a duel against the impossible. Caesar intends to fight the world from within a cage of his own making. Days drag into nights, supplies vanish. Hunger begins to crawl through the Gallic camp. Smoke from burning horseflesh mixes with the scent of despair. In desperation, Vercingetorix drives the weakest, the elderly, the women, the children, out of Alesia, hoping Caesar's mercy will grant them passage. But no order comes. The gates remain shut. Between the two walls, those cast out lie waiting beneath the autumn rain, their cries fading into silence as vultures gather above. Caesar's men avert their eyes, yet they understand. Compassion cannot win this war. Then, one morning, the ground begins to tremble. From the horizon, the Gallic relief army arrives, a living tide of warriors, their horns thundering through the valleys. Within his ring of walls, Caesar watches calmly as the earth shakes around him. To any other man, this would be the end. But for Caesar, this is the moment he was born for. A test of will against fate itself. The trap is set, the storm is here, and now the impossible begins. The sun rises over Alesia like a blade drawn from its sheath. The land below seethes with life and death intertwined. 250,000 Gauls in the fields, 50,000 Romans behind their walls, and between them a silence heavy with fate. Every man knows that what happens here will decide not only the future of Gaul, but of Rome itself. At dawn, the Gallic relief army makes its first move. Horns cry out across the plains, a sound so vast it drowns the wind. From the hills to the horizon, warriors surge forward in a single wave, their war cries rolling like thunder. The Romans hold their ground behind sharpened stakes and moats lined with iron. Then the first impact shatters the stillness. Arrows streak through the morning mist. Sling stones crash against shields. Gallic cavalry charge, only to meet walls bristling with pikes. The Romans answer with the discipline of a machine, coordinated volleys, precise counterstrikes, ranks closing tight as one living organism of steel. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix seizes the moment. He orders his men to strike from the rear, crashing against Caesar's inner wall. The trap has sprung on both sides. The Romans are surrounded, crushed between two roaring seas of enemies. Yet Caesar remains unflinching. He rides the line, his crimson cloak visible through the smoke, calling out orders above the chaos. "Hold the wall," he shouts, and the men obey as if the word itself carries divine command. Hours bleed into hours. The battlefield becomes a storm of dust and screams. The Gallic relief army hurls everything it has against the Roman fortifications, ladders, rams, even siege towers. But every attack breaks against the walls like waves on rock. Roman engineers repair faster than the Gauls can destroy. By nightfall, the ground outside Alesia is littered with corpses and splintered weapons. Yet the Gauls are not broken. They regroup for another assault, this one larger, fiercer, a final effort to tear Rome's iron ring apart. When dawn breaks again, the earth quakes beneath their charge. Thousands of Gallic cavalry sweep around Caesar's flank, finding a weak point near the northern ridge. The Romans falter. For the first time, the line begins to bend. Caesar sees it, and acts. He rides straight into the breach with his German cavalry, the last reserves he has left. Dust and blood fill the air as he crashes into the Gallic charge head-on. For a heartbeat, the entire world seems to hang in balance, Rome itself teetering between annihilation and immortality. Then, like the snapping of a bowstring, the Gallic formation breaks. Panic spreads through their ranks as Caesar's countercharge slices through their flank. The relief army begins to crumble, their shouts turning to screams, their banners falling one by one. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watches the collapse from his walls. He knows what it means. The gods have spoken, and Rome has answered. The greatest rebellion Gaul ever raised has been broken. When the dust settles, the fields around Alesia lie silent, thousands dead, the air thick with the smell of blood and smoke. Caesar stands amidst the ruin, calm, composed, knowing that in these walls of earth and fire he has reshaped history itself. The morning after the storm is quiet, not peace, but the silence that follows exhaustion, when the world seems to hold its breath. All across the plains below Alesia, bodies lie twisted among shattered weapons and torn banners. The great Gallic host, once a sea of fury, has dissolved into fragments fleeing the field. Inside the fortress, Vercingetorix stands at the ramparts watching the smoke rise. He no longer shouts commands. His sword hangs low, heavy with defeat. Around him, his warriors move in silence. Proud men who had believed they were fighting for the freedom of their people, now staring into the ashes of their last hope. Below, Caesar's army advances in perfect formation, shields glinting under a pale sun. They do not cheer, do not jeer. They march like an executioner approaching the condemned. Every step echoes a truth the world will remember for centuries. Discipline has crushed passion. Vercingetorix knows the end is here. There will be no relief army, no miraculous reversal. His people are starving. The walls that once promised safety now hold them prisoner. That night he gathers his chieftains. The fires burn low as he speaks, his voice steady but hollow. I fought not for myself, but for all of Gaul. Now to save it, I must end this. At dawn, the gates of Alesia are open. A single rider emerges, Vercingetorix, the man who united a nation, now dressed in his finest armour, his horse stepping through the mud of his fallen comrades. He rides to Caesar's camp, surrounded by Roman standards snapping in the cold wind. The legions part before him in silence. All eyes follow as he dismounts and walks toward the Roman commander seated upon his curule chair. For a long moment, the two men, the rebel and the conqueror, face each other. Then Vercingetorix kneels, removes his sword and lays it at Caesar's feet. A gesture not of weakness, but of acceptance. The final act of a warrior who fought the greatest power on earth and refused to surrender until no path remained. Caesar says nothing. History records no speech, no smile, only that the Roman general looked upon his defeated foe and gave the signal. Vercingetorix was taken in chains, destined for a triumph in Rome and a death in its shadows. Above the fields of Alesia, crows rise into the cold air. The war for Gaul is over. The tribes that once called Caesar a tyrant will soon call him something else, emperor. And yet, even in defeat, the memory of Alesia endures. It is the story of a man who refused to bow and another who refused to break. In that narrow space between freedom and empire, between courage and cruelty, the fate of a continent was decided. The dust has settled. The plains of Gaul are quiet, but silence does not mean peace. Alesia's walls stand as monuments to Roman ingenuity, yet the cost of victory weighs heavily on every man within them. Caesar's legions, though victorious, are exhausted, are bloodied, and stretched to their limits. The Gallic fields around them are littered with the dead. Warriors who came to defend their homeland, civilians caught in the cruel machinery of siege, and the brave who refused to flee Rome has won, but victory here tastes of ash. The air is thick with smoke, the cries of the wounded still echoing in memory. Vercingetorix, once the hope of all Gaul, has been captured. His surrender marks not just the end of the siege, but the collapse of unified resistance across the region. The tribes that rose against Rome are broken, scattered and demoralized, their freedom extinguished, their lands absorbed into the Republic. For Caesar, the triumph is monumental. He has done what no one believed possible, commanding 50,000 Romans against a combined force of 250,000 Gauls and emerging victorious. The double walls of Alesia, the masterful use of fortifications and his precise timing of counterattacks, become the stuff of legend. Yet even he cannot ignore the human toll. The men who survived the siege carry scars both visible and hidden. Some grieve fallen comrades, others wrestle with the memory of the innocents left to starve between the walls. Victory has come at a price that cannot be measured in gold or land. Caesar's genius has saved Rome's honour, but the cost in lives, suffering and shattered lands is staggering. In Rome, the Senate hails Caesar as the liberator of Gaul. Statues are erected, decrees passed, and a 20-day supplicatio celebrates his brilliance. Vercingetorix is paraded in chains through the streets, a stark reminder of Rome's dominance, and later executed. A ritual of victory as cold as it is absolute. Yet history remembers more than the numbers, the walls, or the banners. Alesia becomes a testament to human will, strategy, and resilience. It is proof that one man's leadership, one army's discipline, and one unbreakable plan can bend the impossible to reality. Caesar's victory is not just over armies, it is over chaos, uncertainty, and fate itself. The siege of Alesia endures in memory because it represents the totality of warfare, the brilliance, the brutality, and the unyielding will required to triumph against impossible odds. In the end, the fields of Gaul are quiet, but their story echoes through history. A handful of Romans faced an ocean of warriors, and through courage, engineering, and tactical genius, they stood unbroken. Caesar defied the impossible, and in doing so, forever changed the fate of a continent.